You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 15th of April, 2025, on Monocle Radio.
Is there much mileage in discussing peace in Sudan while the war continues? Will more US universities follow Harvard's example and stand up to the White House? And how would you make your city quieter? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Elizabeth Braw and Vincent McAvenny will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the Ukrainian author Artem Chapeye about his new memoir, Ordinary People Don't Carry Machine Guns, a reflection of his own service in his nation's defence. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalisation, and by Vincent McAvenny, journalist and Monocle Radio regular politics commentator. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Elizabeth, first of all, I was going to talk to you about what we all got up to at the Delphi Economic Forum last week because you were supposed to go and then didn't.
Yes, I was supposed to speak about the shadow fleet, which is one of the most pervasive and annoying and subversive problems out there in the globalized economy, such as it is. But there was another problem in the globalized economy, which was that there was a strike at the Athens airport for, I guess, a whole day. So
there was a strike everywhere in everything in Greece for a whole day.
Okay, well, I didn't get to see that because I didn't get to Greece as a result of the strike. But I hear it was a good forum anyway.
It was a good forum, but you have been talking about other maritime matters elsewhere.
Yes, I have. There's never a dull day in the world of shipping. And the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which is a multilateral organization that's based right here in London, because London is the global hub of shipping.
It sounds like a gang of superheroes.
That too. The IMO, or IMO as the insiders say, is based here in London and had a meeting a few days ago, well, that ended a few days ago on the 11th, where the members of this committee that met, a number of nations, managed to agree on a plan to cut CO2 emissions in shipping, which is a big thing. Now it just has to be adopted. But this is a breakthrough.
Vincent, you are one of very, very few Londoners kind of hoping that this unseasonal early spring cold snap continues for a bit.
Yeah, I'm watching the long-range forecast quite carefully because being from Irish and Scottish heritage, I'm doing the London Marathon a week on Sunday, and I really want it to be overcast and chilly and maybe even drizzle and cool me down because running in the heat, as I've found the last 2 weeks, is not great for me. It's my first ever marathon. And I'm just hoping that it doesn't get too hot because, you know, the amount of crowds and the people, I've got friends who've done it on the sort of years where it has been a hot one and it can have a real impact on you. So, yeah, hoping it stays a little gloomy.
I would think. But more positively, you are running in aid of a couple of thoroughly decent causes, which you can go ahead and plug.
Yeah, that's right. I am raising for two charities. The first is the John Schofield Trust, which works both here across the UK and Ireland as well. And it's about taking people from non-traditional diverse backgrounds into careers in broadcast journalism and supporting them through their early years careers. I had this mentorship scheme many years ago, still talk to my mentor, and I am actually mentoring someone this year myself. So I'm raising money for that. And also the Campaign Against Living Miserably, or CALM, which is the main suicide prevention charity here in the UK. So those are the two organisations I'm running for. And yeah, I will be pounding the streets of London a week on Sunday, hopefully in some nice soft drizzle. So if you see me, give me a wave.
Well, we will start in Sudan. It is 2 years today that the country's current conflict began. Though popularly described as a Sudanese civil war, it has been largely a fight between two rival factions of Sudan's military, which Sudan's actual civilians have largely done their best to keep out of the way of. At least 20,000 people have been killed. This is almost certainly a vast undercount, and 13 million have been displaced, of whom around 4 million have left Sudan entirely. Though the capital, Khartoum, was recently retaken by government forces, fighting continues, but a conference is underway here in London seeking a path to peace. Vincent, first of all, it is the UK's Foreign Secretary David Lammy who is hosting this event. Opening it, he said, "We cannot look away." But isn't that what we've been doing for 2 years?
Yes, and obviously David Lammy came into office last July in the new Labour government here, and he is wanting to reset UK relations. He's wanting to play a central role, as we've seen Keir Starmer doing on particularly the issue of Ukraine in international affairs. He's wanting to show that Britain is an internationalist country after the sort of Brexit years. But the fact is the last 2 years have been incredibly busy in terms of geopolitical conflict. We've had continuing Ukraine war, we have had Hamas and Israel, and frankly, and very sadly, sometimes journalism is a game of logistics. And if it's harder and trickier to get into somewhere to tell a story, it means it gets less airtime. And that is the case that it's been with Sudan, and also kind of lack of awareness of what the factors are. It's, telling the story of Ukraine is much easier to Western audiences in particular than it is to explain what exactly is going on in Sudan. And I'm afraid it has fallen by the wayside.
I mean, there have been further aid pledges made by the UK and other countries, Elizabeth, and in a time where people are cutting foreign aid, that's not insignificant. But the foreign aid, it's better than nothing, but it's a band-aid, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But then again, if Western governments, or international governments, I should say, because let's hope that non-Western governments also come through with aid, if they pledge nothing, that would be criticised too. The root cause, as so often, is not with the aid, the amount of aid, but with the willingness on the part of the warring parties to make peace. That is what we see time and again. And so it's great that some aid has been pledged, but if these warring parties continue to want to fight, then the aid is only going to remain a band-aid. And as Vincent was saying earlier, the reason that this conflict has been neglected, both when it comes to attention and aid and mediation, is that those involved in it have kept journalists out because they don't want attention to it. So there is so much fault on the part of the warring parties, especially the Rapid Response Force, but also the government forces. And it is the case that this is another situation where we really would need some sort of global police that could step in, but we don't have a global police. The US military was the closest we had to a global police, and I don't think the US military will be stepping in to try to solve this conflict.
Well, the nearest available regional police, Vincent, would appear to be, in theory, the African Union, but they have never been known for their coherence, cohesion or decisiveness. There is now some speculation that the Rapid Support Forces, who are the paramilitaries fighting against the Sudanese army, having been chased out of Khartoum, are now banking on partition, that they want to basically hive off a section of Sudan and that they will control that. The African Union is dead against that, but realistically, does that start to look like the likeliest chance of peace from here? Because otherwise you just end up with these two forces fighting to each other to a standstill for potentially forever, with gruesome consequences for the people in the middle.
Yeah, totally. And I think, as we've said, there's not appetite, there's not attention to really go at this in the long term. And, with the US administration, as much as it does want to play on the international stage, Donald Trump likes nothing more than an easy win, something that he can rack up. He won't have to deal with any of the consequences of it. But he has no record of any interest whatsoever in Africa, apart from, for some unimaginable reason, the largely imaginary plight of white South African farmers. Exactly. But if someone whispers into his ear, hey, that Nobel Peace Prize that you're really obsessed with getting, funding that Obama got, well, you could just quickly say, we're going to partition this. You don't have to hear anything about it ever again. It will never make US news, because these kind of conflicts very, very rarely do, sadly. Then he might step in and apply some pressure. Just the other point I would say, in case anyone listening thinks I'm not thinking about this, but obviously in Gaza at the moment, journalists, Western journalists, are not allowed in. It's all citizen journalists. But what we're seeing actually is a modern divide in the sort of have and have-nots, is that even in Gaza there is a large amount of smartphones, and we're getting a lot of reporting back, out of Gaza, what's going on from smartphones, people live streaming, people doing that. But in Sudan, sadly, obviously there aren't that many of those. There isn't a telecommunications network that's functioning that well. So we're not seeing the sort of images from this place. And it means that there's going to be a divide in the future in places where people do have smartphones in their pockets and those who don't.
I mean, Elizabeth, just finally on this, the African Union, like most organisations of that sort, has a horror, and quite a reasonable one, really, of borders being redrawn. But is there particular concern in this instance, the idea, which has been one that has been at large for the last couple of years, that this war could spread, that it could draw in countries on Sudan's borders, of which I think there are 7. Please don't write in if I'm wrong. I'm sticking with 7.
There is always a risk with conflicts, if they are not contained, that they spread beyond the borders. And any neighbour of a warring country will always try to contain that conflict, and to try to contain that conflict may try to intervene, and then that may backfire. So essentially, if you're a neighbour of Sudan and you're trying to help or at least contain the conflict, you also risk having the conflict spread if you intervene. And that is why we have international organizations, peacekeepers and so forth. But the peacekeepers can only be deployed if there is peace to keep. So it is really a wicked problem that goes... it really goes back to the two warring factions or parties, and the fact that they seem to have no interest in doing the right thing.
Well, to the United States now, and the ongoing conversion of its federal government into a protection racket. Among the institutions to which President Donald Trump has uttered words to the effect of "nice place you have here, wouldn't want anything to happen to it," have been the United States universities, which Trump and his regime believe to be overwhelmingly populated by highfalutin, fancy-pants, book-learning Poindexters. To that end, the administration has fired off querulous letters to several such ivy-shrouded seats of learning, telling them to get in line or lose federal funding. Harvard, for one, and though they may have phrased it more delicately, has told the president to cram it. Accordingly, $2 billion in federal funding has been frozen. Vincent, these things that the White House wanted the universities to do, and as is so often the case, merely reciting the facts of what is occurring sounds like you are concocting some fantastical dystopian satire. They wanted to ensure among the faculty viewpoint diversity, i.e. people who agree with the president, and they wanted universities to report students who are hostile to the government. Now, admittedly, I didn't spend very long at university, but if they'd slung out every student who was hostile to the government, it would have been a pretty quiet campus. That's kind of the point of universities.
Yeah, I think firstly we have to preface this discussion by saying, as always for Donald Trump, it's personal. He had to pay a very large multi-million-dollar settlement a few years ago before becoming president for the first time because he was running a scam university operation, which no longer functions, Trump University. So obviously this is something that he still feels vengeance for. And it's quite glad to see, after Columbia, another Ivy League school, recently sort of basically kind of collapsed a little bit of its opposition towards policies like this. And we've seen, other universities supposedly giving details on who the protesters were last year in the sort of Palestinian support encampments. It's quite nice to see Harvard stand up to this. It is losing potentially $2 billion in money. But I have looked it up, and its endowment is currently $53.2 billion as of June last year, the most of any university. It obviously has a strong and powerful alumni who will probably rally to its cause and continue funding it, because you get a lot more of that in the US. The real danger is, of course, that the valuable tax break, that could be a big change for Harvard. But I think many people will be applauding in the US. We're starting to see the sort of seeds of resistance to this institutional attack all over the place. And the fact that Harvard is standing up and saying, we're not going to abide by this. They probably think, look, we can ride this out for maybe another 18 months. He's probably going to suffer in the midterms. And then, if everything goes to plan, he'll be gone by the end of 2028. So we probably just need to ride it out until then, and we've got the money in the war chest for it.
Well, exactly. I mean, with $53 billion in the bank, you can ride it out till the sun dies, never mind the midterms. But can we hope or expect, Elizabeth, that this is going to bite the US eventually? Because people will leave. That expertise, the people who operate at that level, the people who are employed by elite universities, who study at elite universities, these are by and large people who can go anywhere, and they will.
They will. The question is whether there will be jobs waiting for them when they try to leave. But we are already seeing academics leaving or expressing the wish to leave, trying to leave, applying for jobs in Europe. I think the challenge is you will, in any liberal democracy, you'll have universities and academics who say things the government doesn't like, and it can be annoying. I'm sure every prime minister in the UK has been annoyed by something that academics have said, but it's the price we pay for our liberal democracies, and we all benefit from it. And I think this is what Harvard is the point Harvard is trying to make. And we'll see what that leads to among other universities. So it's, as Vincent said, Harvard is the first university to push back against these demands. Others that were asked to make similar commitments before Harvard complied. Harvard has said, no, we're not going to. And so it will be interesting to see what the next university that receives one of these letters says or does in response.
Hey, Vincent, as Elizabeth suggests, this is a tale as old as time. Governments getting up in arms, whether they're actually upset or just pretending to be upset about what the kids are up to on campuses, etc. At which point I will introduce for discussion my own personal prejudice, which is that, where am I putting the age limit? I'll call it 25. Nobody over the age of 25 should care in the slightest about anything that occurs on any university campus anywhere.
I mean, I wouldn't fully go along with that. I mean, yeah, student politics is a bit of a, kind of cosplay, isn't it? But I do think...
But it's where, genuinely, it's where people go to figure stuff out, to test ideas, to have arguments, to very often express extremely silly opinions in public, which 20 years later they will look back on and think, oh,
yeah,
my God.
No, that is true. But I think why people are, careful or very interested in this is, it's the fact that they're trying to kind of cajole the institutions to be people that sort of shop in their students, that report on, where does it draw the line? Are we going to sort of be going through their essays now and picking out, suspect sentences and that kind of thing? And, I do think it's good for Harvard, remember visiting Harvard twice, and I think the crest is the word just veritas, truth. It is America's oldest university. It was sort of founded on the principle of kind of stepping out the shadows of higher education as it was in Britain at the time, and wanting to pursue rigorous truth and not thinking, that some of the ideas, heavily influenced by religion that were present in British universities. So it is good. It's sort of standing up for that core principle. But I mean, this is again Donald Trump trying to light little fires everywhere so that you're so bewildered about what is going on, you can't really focus.
Well, to France and Algeria, two countries poised perpetually on the verge of a massive diplomatic brouhaha, one of which is underway as of this broadcast. Algeria has issued marching orders to a dozen French diplomats after, and listeners may want to start taking notes around now, French Plod arrested an Algerian diplomat alleging that he was involved in last April's kidnapping of an Algerian TikTok star, Amir Boukouz, who tees off frequently at Algerian Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune and has been granted asylum by France, which has rebuffed repeated extradition requests from Algeria. As of this broadcast, also, Algeria denies everything, and in the last few minutes, it has been confirmed that France is slinging out an equivalent 12 Algerian diplomats and is recalling its ambassador from Algiers back to Paris for, it says here, talks. Elizabeth, why would Algeria pick this fight? This does all look from a distance just somewhat silly.
It does look a bit silly. Expelling diplomats is what we do with Russia and proper adversaries, and not so much with countries with whom we have long and, let's say, intimate relationships. Of course, the relationship between France and Algeria hasn't been entirely harmonious, but nevertheless, they are not like Western Europe or Europe vis-à-vis Russia. But it just shows, and I think this is an important point for all us ordinary citizens to remember, that the maybe outspokenness / carelessness of an ordinary citizen these days can grow into a diplomatic dispute. We have seen it several times in recent years with people going to Westerners going to Russia, China, Iran, even Taliban, Afghanistan, because they thought it might be a good idea or maybe enjoyable, and they found themselves detained for whatever reason and had to be freed through painstaking negotiations that often involved their home country releasing a proper criminal in exchange.
But Vincent, do we not see here the difference between a Democrat and a demagogue? I mean, our previous item, we were talking about Donald Trump's extreme thin-skinnedness towards protests on campuses. Surely the response of any sensible national leader to being told, sir, or indeed madam, someone's having a go at you on social media, is to respond, and good luck to them.
Yeah, you do get the Barbra Streisand effect here, where the more that you sort of react to it, the more attention it does get. So it is incredibly thin-skinned. And honestly, I think, we are kind of entering our third decade now of social media. We're sort of midway through it. The fact that people kind of haven't built up an immunity to this, it is just an Instagram account. It is just a TikTok account. It sort of shows your own...
It is, in fairness, a big TikTok
account. It is, but it sort of shows your own vulnerability and your own sort of insecurities. And it's the fact that you're not going to address any of the issues and rather go after the people pointing them out is a sign of pretty strong weakness.
But I have to add, in defence of Liz Truss, who didn't get many things right while serving as Prime Minister here in the UK.
Understatement.
She didn't have time apart from anything else.
But to her credit, she didn't even try to get, what was it, the Daily Express, one of those newspapers. The Daily Star, to take down the letters and the camera. This is the beauty of liberal democracy, is it not? You get to compare the Prime Minister to a vegetable, if you like.
But on that thought, and just finally on this, Elizabeth, is there still a calculation that an authoritarian government makes? Do they just lash out because they are thin-skinned and touchy, or do they think, OK, we might, in the eyes of some people chuckling in a radio studio in London, look a bit ridiculous, but there is a political gain to be made from this which makes up for that?
Well, Andrew, as somebody who has written a book about East Germany, I can tell you what the game of autocrats and authoritarian regimes is. They want to frighten you, so they make a big deal out of punishing somebody to frighten everybody else, and it usually works because you don't want to be the guy or woman who is detained or sent to prison for merely having expressed a view, but they select seemingly randomly citizens to be sent to or detained or sent to prison so that nobody else will get it into their heads that they might like to express a view critical of the government.
Well, to Lisbon now and the ongoing efforts of the Portuguese capital to turn the volume down. Back in 2014, Lisbon launched a noise action plan, which weirdly has a much less satisfying acronym than NAP in Portuguese. I checked, we have people here who speak it. As part of this endeavour, Lisbon has updated its strategic noise map, from which we glean that nearly 14% of Lisboeta are still exposed to excessive racket. Among the most pestilential nuisances are road traffic, cruise ship noise, airport din and over-exuberant nightlife. Vincent, obviously a city cannot be entirely silent, although listeners are probably fashioning their own jokes about towns that they have visited which are a bit that way after 9 o'clock on a weekend evening, and a big hello to all our listeners in Adelaide. But should, as a general principle, cities try to keep the noise down?
I think cities are disconcerting when it is too quiet, and we all found that in the pandemic. If you were living in central London, it just feels eerie if a city's too quiet, and you know that something is wrong. I think that's the problem with it. I think when it comes to news, you have to accept, look, if you're living in a city, you are going to place, and you want to be in a place where there is more hustle and bustle. There is a little bit of noise that I think we could eradicate. I mean, for here in London, rickshaws which play, mid-2000s pop music at full volume
should be thrown into the Thames along with their drivers.
Exactly. Anyone that's watching something or doing a call on a speaker rather than headphones on public transport
should be tasered.
Exactly. I mean, there are little things like that I think we can all agree they should be stopped. But I think you do have to put up with a little bit of noise. I mean, the one thing at the moment which is really a problem here in London, and we were talking about it last week on the show as well, on the Globalist story about New York, is that you are getting people moving into areas, here in London, for instance, Soho. In New York, it's like Brooklyn, moving to these areas with a vibe, with an energy, and then complaining about the noise and getting venues shut down and shutting down nightlife. And here in London, the Mayor Sadiq Khan is sort of pushing back on this and trying to create a zone in London, in Soho, which is for over a century, a real place where you go out. It's not where you move for a quiet life. And the fact that developers have come in, built these flats, and then these people who often aren't actually living in these flats, and most of the time it's a pied-à-terre, are complaining about noise and getting clubs shut down. I mean, it is wrong, and I think you have to accept, look, if you want to, Portugal is a small, but it's a lovely country, and it's got lots of countryside, and you could live in the countryside and commute in if you need to.
Unsympathetic, Vincent. I did want to close by asking you both for examples of, either extremity, either somewhere notably noisy or notably quiet that you have visited. And I should say Adelaide, actually, there's loads to do, really, on the weekend. I don't know why I picked on Adelaide. If you grow up in Australia, it sort of becomes reflex. Elizabeth, have you ever been somewhere and thought either this is just kind of eerily or indeed pleasantly quiet, or, oh my God, how does anybody live here with this racket?
Not... I don't have a particular answer to that question, but what I have noticed over decades of living in various places is that it's lovely to hear church bells. And I have also...
is it though? From maybe like nicely, languidly in the distance, you don't want it next door, do you?
Well, actually, once you've heard the bells a few times, you don't even notice them anymore. And it is actually sort of a nice touch to modern life. And these bells have been around for decades, in many cases centuries, and they'll be there for many centuries to come, and we are just passing through. And on that note, or on that basis, I think it is along the lines of what Vincent said about the nightlife in Soho. It's incredibly selfish when people buy a house or rent a house next to a church and then want the church bells taken down or silenced. They were there first. They will be there after you die, or otherwise leave your premises. So get used to it, or live in a suburb, or indeed far away from any other habitation.
Related to the bells issue, Vincent, I do sincerely believe that you should be given a free pass on arson in the event of your neighbours hanging wind chimes.
Well, I mean, on that point, I was going to say, if you've ever stayed in a hotel or lived next to a harbour, that's a really weird noise to get used to, because the jingle jangle of the ropes and the sails and the masts and the fenders of the boats, that can be, especially in the winter, that can get a really annoying din.
You get seduced by the sea view, and it's just like, oh my God, what are we doing?
And on that note, one of the places I lived in Washington, D.C., which was in the early 2000s, when Dick Cheney was vice president, was on the route of from the vice presidential residence to the White House. So there was a lot of motorcade sounds and obviously the blue light sounds that go with it every single day. And I can tell you, he rose early and went to work early.
Did you ever try writing in to complain?
I didn't. But then again, I didn't complain about the church bells either.
Elizabeth Braw and Vincent McAvenny, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the title of the new book by Ukrainian author Artem Chapeye is a willful untruth. It's called Ordinary People Don't Carry Machine Guns. In reality, ordinary people carrying machine guns is pretty much the story of modern conflict, as Chapeye well knows, as he is one of them. The book examines his own decision to join Ukraine's military after Russia attacked the country in 2022, and it reflects on his service in his country's uniform since. I spoke to Artem earlier and began by asking if he was surprised by how clear the decision to enlist seemed to him.
It didn't start at the very beginning, but within, I would say, 24 hours, the choice was clear. Even though before that I considered myself a pacifist and I translated Mahatma Gandhi into Ukrainian. As soon as you have to evacuate your own kids, as soon as you have to leave your own apartment, you're in front of a choice whether you want to be a victim or want to fight back, And I would say the choice became clear within the first day, maybe a day and a half.
Was it that instant for you? Because obviously, as you were suggesting there, you have two very young children. I think when you make this decision, you're 40 or at least in your early 40s, it would have been very easy for you to say, this is not my war.
I think this is the reason why it took the whole 24 hours. I think if I wouldn't have children, I would have made the decision even faster.
What do you think now about people who made a different choice, as many Ukrainians did, who decided to try to avoid service, tried to leave the country or have left the country? Do you think of them differently than you did 3 years ago?
I would say this has been shifting all the time, the attitude. And I feel that it's not only my attitude, but the attitude of most of the soldiers. At the very beginning, you feel like the connection between the people who make different choices is being broken. But then again, when time passes, you feel like acceptance that people make different choices. It has been like that in all wars. There's another thing which is also important, that the more, I would say, the more high class, meaning rich people are, the more privileged people are, the less likely that they will make a choice to fight. And so for me, this was literally, I see this book, as my own, if you want a comparison, I see this book as my own homage to Catalonia. That's one of the first breakthrough books by Orwell, and he shows how he was also somewhat disappointed. At the same time, he felt glad to be with the people, the common people. And so this was also my thing. I saw that in the Ukrainian army, there's mostly the common, decent people. There are also some people who have been privileged, and mostly these are volunteers, but no privileged people who didn't want to get to the army didn't go, whereas the unprivileged often have to go whether they want it or not. This is something which struck me.
Has that experience caused you to think about Ukraine in a different way? Because Ukraine is obviously a subject you've written a great deal about before, probably most famously in your book, The Ukraine. Has being that experience of fighting to defend it and fighting alongside people you might otherwise not have got to know changed how you see things?
I would say I was struck but not surprised. The book, The Ukraine, which I have written before the war, was about how different the show-off patriotism is from real stuff. And I like to say now, because as you know, probably the Ukraine is like the incorrect name, but I tend to show it as, actually I took the name from D.H. Lawrence, who spoke about the rich forgetting the England, which is really England. That's, I think, from Lady Chatterley's Lover. For me, like the Ukraine, which is really Ukraine, is now still defending this so-called like patriotic, glossy version of Ukraine. So for me, this is it. It's like the common people who are defending the privileged very often. And I think that's usually the case with most of the wars. Orwell, by the way, also wrote about how during the bombing of London, a lady in a Rolls Royce is more damaging to the morale than the whole fleet of Goering's airplanes. And I think this is something similar. Like I came back to Kiev and you see that a person in a Tesla Cybertruck is probably more damaging to morale than the whole fleet of Russian or Iranian-Russian Shahed drones.
We should make clear to our listeners that you are still serving. You are still a soldier in Ukraine's army. What has your war been like over these last 3 years?
At the time I was finishing the Ordinary People Don't Carry Machine Guns, I was in Pokrovsk, which is now in the news. At that time, it was, I would say, calmer, even though people around me were dying. My mission, if you could say that, was convoying, basically guarding the Russian prisoners of war, the prisoners of war who were Ukrainians but mobilized into Russian army, because Russia has been mobilizing from the occupied territories, and also some mercenaries. So I was in the military police working with the prisoners of war. And I must say that in my unit, I have never witnessed any violence towards them, even though people were talking like all the time, like, see what the Russians are doing with ours. But, I think it depends a lot on the commander. Since then, like for the last more than half a year, I have been doing paperwork. I think basically because I'm a writer and a person who knows several foreign languages, including English, they transferred me to a headquarters to do some paperwork, including translating and stuff like that.
Do you have a perspective yet on what kind of country Ukraine will be after this war ends? How it will have been changed by it, and what kind of country Ukraine will be 5 or 10 years from now?
At the moment, we still don't know how the war will end. These negotiations are going through. And by the way, I wanted to thank the UK or the peoples of the United Kingdom, because unlike the US, like you have had something of a relay race of prime ministers. We still have songs about Boris Johnson, who is more popular in Ukraine than in the UK. And despite you having 3 different prime ministers, you're still supporting Ukraine. So we still don't know how the war will end. But I have a feeling that there will be something of a myth of like everybody joining the defense anyways. And I see it's something like what the Finns have. Maybe you remember right before World War II, Finland was invaded by Stalin, and they still have a myth about how they had at least a moral victory, like a much smaller country not letting the invader take their country as a present, as a piece of cake, as Putin probably thought in the beginning, as Russian propaganda at least presented it at the beginning. I am afraid we will lose some of the territories, and I'm afraid there will be some of the split inside the country at the beginning, because some people will probably be disappointed. But I think that with time, especially as generations come, there will be something of a legend of how Ukrainians bravely stood up to Russian. And maybe that's a good thing, but also the books that the one that I'm writing now are also somewhat presenting, are aimed at myth, destroying that myth, because I like the truth. It's like Orwell said this in his Homage to Catalonia, that basically he is already participating in the, you can say, historical war or memory war, and I feel that I also am doing it right now.
That was Artem Chapeye. His tremendous new book, Ordinary People Don't Carry Machine Guns, Thoughts on War, is available now. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Elizabeth Braw and Vincent McAvenny. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jokes. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.